In this lesson, we will be looking at chapter 14.7 through 14.10. We're going to investigate life histories of different organisms. Life history is like a species summary. This is going to give us a lot of information about how the organism lives when it reproduces and how often it reproduces. Keep in mind, life histories are shaped by natural selection, and the life history refers to the overall lifestyle of one species. Life history includes vital statistics of the species. This includes age of first reproduction, possibilities of survival and reproduction at each age, litter size and frequency, and longevity of the organism overall. There are many life history strategies. It's important to know that no one strategy is the perfect answer for every situation. There is a lot of variation because many strategies work in different conditions. If these strategies did not work, natural selection would work to weed them out, and those organisms and species would go extinct. So there are many possible responses to the challenge of when to reproduce, how often to reproduce, and how much to reproduce. So we're going to investigate some of the major strategies that are seen in nature. Life histories have to do with division of energy and trade-offs in an organism's life. Each animal has only so much energy to spend during its lifetime. In general, energy can be spent on reproduction, maintenance, or in growth. Again, organisms have to divide energy between these three categories, and life histories show us different strategies, particularly for reproduction and how energy is divided over time or spent all at one time. Keep in mind, reproductive investment is a big part of life. Organisms reproduce to pass their genes on to the next generation. But babies are expensive. It takes a lot of energy and materials to both produce babies and to raise them, especially for females. It is important to consider overall lifetime reproductive investment as well as event-by-event reproduction. There's also a cost for reproductive events. Mating can be risky. Being out in the open, finding mates, or mating can actually increase your risk of predation, make you easier for predators to find. There's also wear and tear on the body, especially for females. Carrying litters of babies around is very taxing on females. So, organisms are trying to maximize lifetime reproductive success, their overall number of babies that they leave behind in a generation. Organisms have to look at a couple of major questions. One is survival for future reproductive episodes. Should they save for the future, or should they put all of their reproductive energies into one big event? Sometimes high predation rates makes multiple events unlikely in the lifetime of an organism, so putting all of your reproductive energy into one or very few events is a better strategy. We're going to see that some organisms have a single episode of reproduction in their lifetime, while others have repeated episodes of reproduction throughout their lifetime. The first reproductive strategy we're going to look at is Big Bang reproduction. When these animals reach sexual maturity, they're going to mate one time and put all of their energy into reproducing. At the end of their reproductive event, these animals will die. They put zero amount of energy into growth and maintenance for themselves. One example of Big Bang reproduction is the antechinus. This type of mouse reaches sexual maturity about 1 year of age. They mate intensely for about 3 weeks, and then the males die shortly after mating. Females will bear their litters, wean them, and then they usually die right after the first litter is gone. The second life history strategy is fast, intensive reproductive investment. These animals reach sexual maturity at a fairly young age. They then produce many litters over a short time frame. A good example of this is the house mouse. These animals reach sexual maturity at about 1 month of age. They then reproduce frequently, producing litters of 6 to 10 offspring about every month. If we look at the overall lifespan of these mice, they don't live very long. They're putting some energy into maintenance of self so that they live past one reproductive event. But they are putting a lot of energy into each reproductive event, which is going to shorten their overall lifespan. The third reproductive strategy we're going to look at is slow, gradual reproductive investment. These animals tend to reach reproductive maturity at a much later age, and they produce fewer offspring at a time with larger gaps in between. Generally, they have a lot of time spent on each individual offspring to make sure that they reach maturity themselves. An example of this is seen in bats. Bats reach sexual maturity at about 1 year of age, and they produce small litters, usually one offspring per year. It takes a long time for that offspring to reach maturity and be weaned and go off on its own, especially compared to something like the mouse. These organisms are putting a lot of energy into maintenance for self and less energy into each reproductive event. This gives them a longer lifespan overall and more reproductive events. In general, these organisms may all produce the same number of offspring that survive to adulthood, no matter what their life history strategy. However, the investments and the strategy of getting to that end number is going to be different. I mentioned before that no one life history strategy is the best. Natural selection favors different reproductive strategies based on the environment, and there are always trade-offs. Here's a practice problem. Salmon live most of their lives at sea and then return to their natal rivers and streams to reproduce and die. Which type of reproductive strategy does this exemplify? Take a minute, pause the video to figure this question out. The answer is Big Bang reproduction. These animals reproduce one time. They put all of their energy into that reproductive event and zero energy into maintenance. Therefore, after reproduction, those fish will die. We have said that there are 3 areas to which an organism can allocate its resources. We've talked a lot about reproduction and maintenance for survival. We can also look at their energy production and growth. Some organisms, like our salmon, have Big Bang reproduction, so they put a lot of energy into survival until they reproduce, at which point all their energy goes into reproduction. Some organisms focus more on reproduction and growth, and we see a trade-off between these two. Beech trees, for example, grow more slowly in years when they produce many seeds. In years where they produce few seeds, they will put more energy into growth, making themselves bigger and larger overall. We also see trade-offs in the number and size of offspring. Medium-sized eggs in lizards are often preferred and selected for. Smaller eggs can be produced in higher numbers, but there is a poor survival rate of the offspring. Large eggs can only be produced a few at a time, but they have a better survival rate of the offspring. So medium-sized eggs are a trade-off between these two strategies. With medium eggs, you can have a good number of eggs, and you have a better chance of survival than with tiny eggs. Here's a practice question. Peacocks use their beautiful tails to attract mates. However, this beautiful tail affects its ability to evade predators. This is an example of which kind of evolutionary trade-off. Pause the video and take a moment to figure this out. The correct answer is reproduction and survival. The bigger and prettier the tail is, the more times this male will get to reproduce. However, the bigger and prettier the male is, the harder time he has in survival. It makes him more visible to predators. So he has to balance his energy between reproducing and spending energy to evade predators. Life histories are often figured out using life tables. A life table allows biologists to predict an individual's likelihood of either dying within a particular age interval or surviving the interval. This life table for these finches shows us that birds live to be up to 15 years old. We can measure a population following a specific cohort or group of birds that are the same age through their entire life to gather the data for this life table. We can count each number of bird that is alive during each interval. So in this case, we see at 0 years there are 210 birds. The proportion of being alive is 100% or 1. Okay, during that first block of time, 0 to 3 years, we see that 140 deaths occurred, and the probability of dying during that interval was 67%. We do this throughout the bird's entire lifespan until all of the birds have passed away. This gives us a good idea of what is occurring in these birds' lives. Life tables are used to put together survivorship curves. Survivorship curves looks at the probability of surviving during the lifespan of an organism. There are 3 major patterns that we see in survivorship curves. Type 1 curves have a very high survivorship or survival rate during the lower parts of their lifespan, and it's not until old age where we see a steep drop-off. Humans, primates, elephants, and other large mammals often fall into the Type 1 survivorship curve. Type 2 survivorship curves show a linear trend of decrease. It starts with a large number of individuals, and they decrease or die off at a regular rate throughout their lifespan. Type 2 survivorship curves are often seen in medium-sized mammals, such as rodents, many birds, and beavers. A Type 3 survivorship curve starts with a large number of offspring, most of which who do not survive until adulthood. After that, we see a leveling off of the population, and most of the survivors will survive and live until old age. Type 3 curves are often seen in organisms such as oysters and insects. Here's another picture of the 3 survivorship curves. Turtles show a Type 1 survivorship curve with high survivorship until old age and then rapid decrease as they get older. These kingfishers show a Type 2 curve, which shows a steady decrease at a regular pace, a linear trend of decrease over time. Type 3 includes high mortality early in life, and those that survive can live to be very old. Mackerels are an example of a Type 3 curve. Here's a practice problem. Polar bears are long-lived. They usually give birth to 2 cubs per litter every 3 years. Most cubs survive to adulthood. Which survivorship curve best describes polar bears? The correct answer is a Type 1 curve. Polar bears have a high survival rate until old age, when they drastically drop off. This lesson has investigated life history strategies and trade-offs in different organisms. Be sure to look over the learning objectives posted in Blackboard to help you study for this lesson.